Why Venezuela is not Cuba? Today we discuss.
Welcome to Venezuela Insider, the only place in Venezuela for expats, digital nomads, entrepreneurs, investors, travelers, and related internationals. For more information, venezuelainsider.com.
First, I have to say that everything that I'm going to say today is going to piss off a lot of my fellow Venezuelans. And actually, I'm making this video for them, not for the Western and international, but please, if you want to learn a little bit more, please stick around. Because one of the reasons, one of the, the models, the slogans, the clickbaits that they like to use when they describe the Venezuelan situation, basically since the Chavismo arrived in the country, is that Venezuela is turning into Cuba, and Venezuela is already Cuban. And is not the case. And I'm going to explain why. But first, I'm going to explain this particular dichotomy, comparing that, because the relationship between Venezuela and Cuba. Well, since 98, when Chavez got elected, and 99 took possession of the Venezuelan government, he always had excellent relationships with Cuba, and especially with Fidel Castro. And when Fidel Castro passed away, I mean, Chavez passed away first, and a few years later, Fidel passed away as well. And right now Maduro has good relationships with Cuba. And what happened is that Chavez was actually very impressed, since, comes from the left. He was very, he liked the Cuban model and so on. And also he wanted to implement Cuban policies within Venezuela. And the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela on the political level is basically that actually since early on the Chavez administration, and still today on a lesser degree, Venezuela sends crude oil to Cuba. Basically, Cuba received at some point around 200,000 barrels of crude oil when Venezuela produced 3 million barrels. And right now, Venezuela is producing 800,000, and Cuba receives something around 50,000, 40,000 barrels of crude oil, but receive a lot, a lot of economical aid. Cuba received a lot of economical aid from Venezuela, but that diminished a lot on the past decade. In exchange, Cuba sent medical doctors to the country, and they have a little bit of medical doctors. So there are still some of them left, but it was a big deal back then. Also, medical personnel. Also people that work on the sports enhancement, conditioning industry. I'm talking people, trainers, Cuban sport trainers that help Venezuelans on their sports development for the Olympics and so on, because Cuba is actually very good. It's a powerhouse in Latin America regarding Olympic sports and so on. And actually they won a bunch of medals on these particular events like the Olympics. And Venezuela actually has improved a little bit, quite something. In Venezuela, the Venezuelan government, since Chavez and Maduro, have invested a lot on the Olympic athletes and so on. Well, but that's for another day. Anyways, there is an excellent diplomatic relationship between the Venezuelan government since the Chavismo arrived, and still on a lesser degree regarding the exchange, but still is an exchange. And that worried since the day one the average Venezuelan, because the standards of living back then by Venezuelans were good for Latin American standards, and the standards of living in Cuba are dreadful, I have to say. Sorry if you listen to this from Cuba. And what happens is that, so this main concern, every time that the standards of living drop in the country, especially during the collapse of last decade, of 80% GDP collapse, the standards of living of Venezuelans dropped significantly, of course, that nobody is denying that, and went from, let's say, or Western European country, those were the standards of living of Venezuelans, let's say on 2010s, from a decent Western Europe economy to, on the worst case, below average of the Latin American standards of living, and right now are closer to the Latin American standard of living. Remember, Latin America has a bunch of countries, and most of them are poor. And for instance, Mexico has a better standard of living than the average Latin American nation. And Venezuela right now, I will say the standard of living for the average Venezuelan is just slightly worse than the average top 5 Latin American economies. Remember, in Latin America, it's not like we have excellent standards of living overall. And Cuba, on this particular pecking order regarding standards of living, Cuba is one of the worst. I believe just over 80. And, Haiti has a bunch of things going on. And some other Central American nations, and all of these forgotten nations in South America, Suriname and French Guiana, and places like that. Well, you can get the idea. The standards of Cuba, the standards of living in Cuba are basically terrible, I have to say. Now, how people live in Cuba, and please, I've never been in Cuba, I've done some research, but if you're from Cuba, you can leave on the comments below. If I made a mistake, I can make a mistake, of course. Well, in Cuba, salaries are very low, very, very low. But there are some, let's say, social programs that, the poverty line in Cuba, I mean, most people in Cuba are quote-unquote poor. That's not a discussion. However, they're poor, like, they are homeless or something like that. I mean, what I can see is that most people in Cuba have their own home, not a fancy home, but a home. They don't have access to good food and good, healthy, not healthy food, but I mean, at least the bare minimum. So that's the thing about Cuba, that from what I can see outside looking in, is that the standard of living, I mean, they have like a defined line of poverty, that you have the bare minimum, housing, education, some food and stuff, but nothing much. And if you want to increase your standards of living in Cuba, usually what happens is that it's very, very difficult to go way above that line, unless you have a successful Cuban migrant, a Cuban relative that lives in Miami, let's say, because most of my Cuban migrants are in Miami, but there are other places in Latin America. I met quite a few. And they send you an extra money, you can have access to the private economy over there that is very, very expensive. And regarding healthcare and education, they have basic healthcare access. And also regarding the food, this is the most controversial about how the food supply works, is that you have like a car where they give you rations for that particular car, some a small amount of eggs and milk, and beef is a luxury over there. They eat mostly pork. By the way, I love Cuban food, but the one in Miami, I tried it in Miami only. Sometimes I make myself a Cuban sandwich, by the way. Well, fun fact. Well, but they have access, because I heard this, it's very difficult to have access to beef over there in Cuba, and they have access mostly, if they eat, meat, they do it either through poultry or pork. They love pork. Most of the Cuban nice dishes, they have pork in it. Very delicious, by the way. Well, but the main issue is that, of course, the standards of living are very low. That's why many people want to leave the island, but right now they can do it legally. Before, until last decade, was something around that they have to live on a boat, because Cuba is an island, in case you don't know, and on a very precarious boat that they reach Miami or maybe other place in, nearby in the Caribbean. But the main issue is, but right now they can actually travel, just take a plane and pick a flight, because Cuba has opened up a little tiny bit to the worldwide economy, since I believe Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, is more of a reformist than Fidel, but right now also Raúl got sick, and I know you have Diaz-Canel, and I'm not going to get into the Cuban politics, because I'm not an expert on that particular regard. Anyways, in order to sum it up, Cubans have a very low standard of living on the grand scheme of things, but still the poverty level is not as low compared to other countries that are very poor, like Haiti, for instance, because they have, a basic line, protection line, social welfare line, housing, education, healthcare, basic healthcare, and this book of rations that they can access. But afterwards, getting a better standard of living is very, very difficult for the average Cuban. And also you have a dreadful infrastructure, a lot of blackouts, the gasoline over there in Cuba is very, very expensive. Any kind of luxury in Cuba is very, very expensive. Now, the issue is that Venezuela is Cuba, it is not. We right now have bad standards of living for the average Venezuelan, have mildly increased since 2017, but it collapsed heavily since the late 2000s to 2017. They went from, let's say, a Western European nation, like, I don't know, the Czech Republic, something like that. Please, if you're from Czech Republic, please take it well enough. So that's kind of our standard of living for the average Venezuelan. And on the 2010s and so on the 2000s, early 2010s, and they collapsed to almost a Haiti South Saharan African nation on 2017. It was bad. It was awful. Believe me, I was there, Gandalf, 3,000 years ago. So, but right now have improved mildly for the average Venezuelan. Of course, inequality has improved as well. Funny, one of the things that Cuba wants to eliminate is wealth inequality. In Venezuela, we have a lot of wealth inequality, but that's not the point. The point is that Venezuela is in Cuba. We have a system called CLAP, C-L-A-P, that in order to access is for the poorer Venezuelans, but actually an average Venezuelan can access. I can access to the CLAP system if I desire to do so. And they give you some rations of food depending on the supply. It's usually cheap food like cooking oil, some rice beans, some canned food, and so on. That is a complement for your particular food requirements if you desire to do so, and you pay a very low rate for such food. And many people compare that particular thing with the rations of the book of rations that the average Cuban has, and it's not the exact same thing. We had some scarcity of food on the shelves of supermarkets and so on 2017. Right now, we are fully shelved, we are fully packed, we are mostly supplied on food, medicine, on that kind of stuff. Now, it's not the same thing. The standards of living for the average Venezuelan are not great, are not excellent, but we have a greater supply of goods and services compared to Cuba. We have access to clothing and apparel from all over the world. We have access to technology. We have access to services, and so on and so on. So we have access to a lot of stuff. Many people are complaining because on 2017, we had a supply side crisis. That's, if you know economics, you know what it is. It's just that the people who, the empresarios, entrepreneurs, they cannot provide their services. Right now, they can. We have oversupply of everything: restaurants, food, clothing, tourism, medicines, everything. And now we have new cars as well. The drawdown right now is compared to the old days. In Venezuela, those things are expensive right now, and most people don't have too much access to truly enjoy those particular services, but they do exist, and that's the main point. What makes you rich or makes you poor is the access of goods and services. Now we have more access, way more access to goods and services, and actually, on a certain degree, I can say that we have some access to some services that were not available even before, I'm talking on the 90s. Because there were a lot of restrictions back then in order to get imported goods. And now, actually, for some businessmen, it's actually way easier to get imported goods and to the particular service around it compared to before the Chavismo. Now, I'm not saying that things were better or worse back then, just mentioning this particular random fact. The main point here is that why Venezuela is not Cuba, at least the average Venezuelan. We have more access to goods and services. Usually the average Venezuelan has way more access than the average Cuban. Usually I'm talking lower middle class and poor Venezuelans, usually they have a family network way higher than the average Cuban. They have like a farm, or that is a family farm, or a family big house, or a very small business, or some old cars, some old machinery, stuff like that. So the average Venezuelan has greater standards of living, way more access of goods and services. The Venezuelan passport is way better than the Cuban passport, something to take into account. So the average Venezuelan has way more opportunities way more access to goods and services, way more standard of living. I know it's bad compared what we used to have on decades past, and even with the Chavismo on the late 2000s, let's say. But still, so something I say this is not, I mean, I'm not going to get political. It's something to be grateful because compared to the life of an average Cuban, actually Venezuelans, despite the fact that everything that we have been through, we have to be grateful. And actually, I'm grateful of being Venezuelan. I'm grateful for everything that I have. And I want the better for my fellow Venezuelans, of course. And I say this, this is just more of a food for thought video, is that I want the best for my average Venezuelan. And I know that the situation looks dire many times because we still have to deal with a bunch of issues right on this year, on 2024. Believe me, I have to deal with those as well. And it's very hard sometimes. But don't get with this particular narrative that the average Venezuelan is like the average Cuban. It's not the case. Venezuela is not Cuba. And I have to say yet again, our standards of living have been diminishing a lot, significantly, but are slowly increasing and gonna keep growing slowly. We're gonna have access right now to technologies and opportunities that right now, just a few years ago, only Western nations have access. You can work remote, you can work online, you can develop a career very quickly using internet, social media, and so on. So you can develop skills and so on. And years to come, that's the message for my fellow Venezuelans. Instead of using this old anachronic paradigm that we had before the Chavismo, where just going to school is gonna guarantee you a nice career path, is not gonna be the case right now. You have to reinvent yourself, recreate yourself, despite of the politics going on, and despite your particular situation at the moment. Develop skills, develop opportunities, create opportunities that even your parents and grandparents didn't have the chance to get access on the first place, and create a better life for yourself, for your family, and for your community.
Thank you for watching Venezuela Insider. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on social media. If you want to work with us, VenezuelaInsider.com. Thanks again, and have a nice day.